I stood in the kitchen, watching the catering team bustle around with their trays of perfectly roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, and glistening cranberry sauce. It was Thanksgiving, a day I'd hoped would be quiet and simple, just me and Sophia unwinding after a long year. I'd always been the guy who kept things steady in our marriage. Bills paid, house maintained, no questions asked. Money wasn't something I flaunted, especially not to Sophia's family. They didn't need to know how much I had tucked away, and honestly, I liked it that way. It kept things clean. Sophia knew I did well, but the details? Those were mine. Her family, though, they were a different story. Always poking, always expecting, like they deserved a piece of whatever we built. I wasn't secretive, just careful, and I figured that was my right. But then Eleanor, Sophia's mother, called a few weeks back. Her voice was sharp through the phone, not asking but telling us we'd be hosting the whole clan this year. "Sophia, you've got that big house," she'd said, like it was her decision to make. I could have pushed back. God knows I wanted to. A quiet holiday sounded like heaven compared to their chaos. But Sophia's eyes lit up at the idea, and I couldn't say no to her. So I gave in, figuring I'd make it work. I wasn't about to slave over a stove, though, not with her family's track record of nitpicking everything. Instead, I called up a catering service, one of the best in the city. 5-star stuff, linen napkins, silver trays, the works. I thought it'd shut them up, show them we could handle their expectations without breaking a sweat. The house smelled amazing when they arrived. Eleanor swept in first, her coat still on, eyeing the place like she was appraising it for auction. Henry, her dad, shuffled behind her, grunting about the drive. Then Jacob, Sophia's brother, sauntered in, his smirk already telling me he'd have something to say. Sophia hugged them all, chattering away, while I stood back, hands in my pockets, waiting for the inevitable. The catering team laid out the spread on our dining table: golden brown rolls, gravy thick enough to drown in, and a pumpkin pie that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I was proud of it, honestly. Thought it'd be a win. We sat down, and for a minute, it was fine. Forks clinked, plates filled up, and I started to relax. Then Jacob leaned back in his chair, chewing loudly, and let out a laugh. "You didn't even cook?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Wow, money's made you lazy, huh?" I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up, and Henry gave a little nod, like he agreed. Sophia just stared at her plate, not saying a word. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, but I swallowed it down. Lazy? I'd spent a small fortune to make this night perfect for them, and this was the thanks I got? I forced a tight smile, biting my tongue so hard I tasted metal. "Just wanted it to be special," I muttered, but Jacob was already digging into his food again, smirking like he'd won something. The rest of the meal dragged on. Eleanor started complaining about the turkey being too dry. Funny, since she'd gone back for seconds. Henry grumbled about how fancy everything was, like it was a crime to have nice things. Sophia tried to keep the peace, laughing too loud at their jokes, but I could see her glancing at me, nervous. I kept quiet, nodding along, telling myself it was just one night. I'd dealt with their jabs before, little digs about my job, my car, how I spoiled Sophia. But tonight felt heavier, like they were testing me, waiting for something to snap. I didn't know it then, but that snap was coming faster than I could have guessed. As the plates emptied, I caught Jacob watching me, his eyes narrow and sharp. "So, what's it cost to get all this delivered?" he asked, leaning forward. "Must be nice, throwing cash around like that." I shrugged, keeping it vague. "Enough," I said, hoping he'd drop it. He didn't. "Bet you could have fed us for a year with what you spent on this," he pressed, and Eleanor chimed in. "Oh, Jacob, don't exaggerate." But her tone said she was fishing too. I clenched my jaw, forcing another smile. "It's Thanksgiving," I said. "Worth it." They didn't push more right then, but the air had shifted. Sophia reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it like she knew I was on edge. I squeezed back, but my mind was already racing. This was just the start, wasn't it? They'd smelled money, and now they were circling. I had no idea how bad it'd get, but looking back, I should have seen it coming a mile away. That night, I thought I was still in control. I was wrong. I needed a break. The dining room was still buzzing with Eleanor's complaints and Jacob's loud chewing when I slipped away, muttering something about checking a work email. Thanksgiving dinner had already worn me thin, and I just wanted a minute to breathe. My office was down the hall, A small room with a desk, a chair, and my laptop, my little sanctuary from the chaos. I shut the door behind me, the click of the latch cutting off the noise, and sank into my chair. The glow of the laptop screen lit up my face as I pulled up an international stock deal I'd been tracking all week. Numbers danced across the display, percentages, projections, a nice little profit ticking up in real time. It was calming, watching something I'd built grow while Sophia's family picked apart the meal I'd paid for. I leaned back, letting the tension in my shoulders ease. Just a few minutes, I told myself. Then I'd go back out there and play the good husband again. The door flew open so fast I nearly knocked my coffee mug off the desk. Sophia stood there, her hair a little messy from running around all night, her eyes darting around the room. "Do you have a phone charger?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. I started to nod, reaching for the drawer where I kept a spare, but then I saw her freeze. Her gaze locked onto my laptop, the screen still open to my trading account. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd seen me work before, but then she lunged forward, grabbing the laptop right out from under my hands. "Hey, what are you?" I started, but she wasn't listening. Her fingers gripped the edges tight, her eyes scanning the screen, and I saw the exact moment it hit her. Her mouth dropped open, a sharp little gasp slipping out. "Wait, what the hell is this?" she said, her voice trembling like she'd just found a dead body. I glanced at the screen, and there it was, plain as day, my bank balance. $12,437,892. I'd been meaning to move some of it into another account, keep things tidy, but I hadn't gotten around to it. Now it was staring her in the face, all those zeros glowing bright. I reached for the laptop, trying to laugh it off. "Soph, come on, it's just—" But she yanked it back, out of my reach, her eyes wide and wild. $12 million? She whispered, like she couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. I stood up, hands out, trying to calm her down. "It's not a big deal, okay? Let me explain." But before I could finish, she spun around and bolted out the door, the laptop still clutched in her arms. I chased after her, my heart pounding, yelling, "Sophia, wait." But she was already halfway down the stairs. I hit the landing just as she burst into the dining room, where her family was still picking at dessert. She didn't even hesitate. "My husband has $12 million, she shouted, her voice echoing off the walls. The room went dead quiet. Eleanor's fork clattered onto her plate, splattering gravy across the tablecloth. Jacob's head snapped up, his mouth still full of pie. Henry leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised like he'd just heard the winning lottery numbers. Sophia stood there, chest heaving, holding my laptop up like it was evidence in a courtroom. I skidded to a stop behind her, my face burning, every eye in the room drilling into me. "Sophia," I hissed, grabbing her arm. "What are you doing?" She shook me off, turning to face me, her expression a mix of shock and something else. Anger, maybe, or betrayal. "You've been hiding this?" she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "All this time." I opened my mouth to answer, but Eleanor cut me off, her chair scraping as she stood. $12 million, she repeated, her voice sharp and accusing. "And we're sitting here eating catered food like you're some average Joe?" Jacob snorted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "No wonder you didn't cook, man. Too busy counting your cash." I could feel the walls closing in, their stares pinning me down. "It's not like that," I said, keeping my tone steady, but my hands were shaking. "I work hard. This is my money." Henry cleared his throat, folding his arms. "Our daughter's married to you," he said slowly, like he was laying out a fact. "That makes us part of this too, doesn't it?" I looked at Sophia, waiting for her to back me up, to say something. Anything, to shut them down. But she just stood there, clutching the laptop, her eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to fix it. I wanted to scream. $12 million wasn't a secret I'd kept to hurt her. It was mine, earned through years of late nights and smart moves. I didn't know them an explanation, didn't know them a dime. But the way they were looking at me now, like I'd been caught stealing from them instead of building something for us, made my stomach twist. Sophia finally set the laptop down on the table, her hands trembling. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, quieter now, but it hit harder than her yelling. I took a step toward her, lowering my voice. "Because it didn't change anything. It's just money, sophomore." But she shook her head, and I knew right then that everything had changed. The air was thick with their greed, their expectations, and I was stuck in the middle, watching my quiet life unravel in front of me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I stood there in the dining room, Sophia's words still ringing in my ears, my laptop sitting on the table like a bomb that had just gone off. The silence didn't last long. Eleanor's fork hitting her plate was the first sound, a sharp clatter that snapped everyone out of their shock. Then they all turned to me at once, their eyes glinting like a pack of vultures spotting a fresh kill. I could feel the weight of it, the shift in the room. Thanksgiving wasn't about family anymore. It was about money, my money. Eleanor straightened up, her lips pursed tight, and pointed a finger at me. "You've been keeping this from us?" she said, her voice thick with outrage, like I'd personally insulted her by not handing over my bank statements years ago. I opened my mouth to respond, but Jacob jumped in before I could get a word out. "You have all that money while we're struggling?" he said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table. I could see the wheels turning in his head, already counting what he thought he could take. Struggling? I almost laughed. Jacob drove a truck that cost more than my first house, and Eleanor and Henry had a nice little place they never stopped remodeling. But I didn't say that. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, trying to keep my cool while they stared me down. Henry, who'd been quiet until now, leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "It's only fair that you share," he said, his tone calm but firm, like he was stating some universal truth. "After all, we're family." That hit me hard. Family. The word felt like a slap, because right then, I realized they didn't see me as one of them. Not really. To them, I was a wallet with legs, a resource they'd just discovered. I glanced at Sophia, hoping she'd step in, tell them to back off, but she was still by the table, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She wasn't saying anything, and that silence was louder than any of their accusations. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Fair," I said, keeping my voice even, though it took everything I had not to yell. "I've worked for every penny of that. I didn't inherit it, didn't win it. I built it." Eleanor scoffed, rolling her eyes like I'd just told a bad joke. "Oh, please," she said. "Don't act like you're some martyr. You've been sitting on millions while we've been scraping by." Scraping by? I wanted to ask her about the new deck they'd added to their house last summer, or the cruise they took every year, but I held it in. Jacob smirked, leaning back now, crossing his arms to mirror his dad. "Yeah, man, you could have helped us out a little. What's a couple million to you?" he said, like it was pocket change I'd forgotten to toss his way. I clenched my fists in my pockets, feeling the heat rise in my chest. They didn't know a thing about what it took to make that money. Nights I didn't sleep, deals I'd sweated over, risks I'd taken while they sat back and complained about their lives. I looked at Sophia again, waiting for her to say something, anything, to stop this madness. She'd always been the bridge between me and her family, smoothing things over when they got too pushy. But now she just stood there, her eyes flickering between me and them, like she was torn. "Soph," I said, my voice low, pleading almost. "You know this isn't right." She bit her lip, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, but before she could answer, Henry spoke again. "He's your husband, Sophia," he said, his tone heavy with expectation. "That money's not just his, it's yours too. And that means it's ours." My stomach dropped. Ours. They were claiming it, right there in my own house, like I'd signed some contract the day I married her. Eleanor nodded, her eyes narrowing. "Exactly. You've got no business hiding it from us. We've been good to you, taken you in like one of our own." Good to me? I almost choked on that. They'd spent years treating me like an outsider, tossing backhanded comments about my job, my choices, how I wasn't fun enough for their precious Sophia. And now, because of a number on a screen, I was suddenly theirs to bleed dry. Jacob grinned, like he'd already won. "Come on, man, don't be stingy. You've got plenty to go around." I shook my head, a bitter laugh slipping out before I could stop it. "Plenty," I said. "You think I owe you because I've got something you don't." The room went quiet again, but it wasn't the stunned silence from before. It was tense, electric, like they were waiting for me to cave. I turned to Sophia one last time, my voice steady but sharp. "You gonna let them do this?" I asked. She looked at me, her eyes wide, and for a second, I thought she might back me up. But then she dropped her gaze, staring at the floor, and I knew I was on my own. That's when it hit me. They'd always been like this, waiting for a chance to pounce, and now they had it. My money wasn't mine anymore, not in their eyes. It was theirs, and they'd tear me apart to get it. I straightened up, meeting their stares one by one. I don't owe you anything, I said, my words cold and final. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. They'd just started, and I was about to find out how far they'd go. I couldn't believe it was happening right there in my dining room. Sophia's family had turned into a pack of wolves, and I was the meal they were ready to carve up. After Henry dropped that line about fairness, the demands started rolling in, one after another, like they'd been planning this all along. Eleanor went first, her voice sharp and commanding. "You should buy us a vacation home in Florida," she said, folding her arms like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "We deserve a place to relax, and you've got the money for it." I stared at her, my jaw tight, wondering how she could say that with a straight face. A vacation home? They already had a house bigger than mine, but apparently that wasn't enough. Before I could even respond, Jacob jumped in, leaning forward with that smug grin I'd always hated. $2 million isn't that much," he said, shrugging like he was asking for a loan to fix his truck. "Just a small gift, to get my business idea off the ground." I felt like I'd stepped into some twisted game show where everyone got a prize but me. My head was spinning, trying to process how they'd gone from eating my turkey to demanding millions in under 10 minutes. I looked at Sophia, standing off to the side, her arms still crossed, her face a mess of shock and something else. Expectation, maybe? She hadn't said a word yet, and that was killing me. I needed her to step up, to tell them they were out of line. But she just stood there, watching it all unfold. Henry cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. "You owe this to us," he said, his voice steady, like he was laying down a law. "We've supported you and Sophia all these years." Supported me? I almost laughed out loud. Supported me how? By showing up to eat my food and criticize my life? I couldn't hold it in anymore. A cold, hard laugh escaped my lips, sharp enough to make them flinch. "Oh, you," I said, my voice louder than I meant it to be. "For what? You didn't build this." "I did." The room got quiet for a second, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd back off. But then Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in. "Don't you dare talk to us like that," she snapped. "You've been hoarding all this money while we've been getting by." Getting by? I wanted to ask her about the new car in their driveway or the trips they bragged about on Facebook, but I didn't. I just shook my head, feeling the anger bubble up inside me. Jacob smirked again, like he was enjoying this. "Come on, man, don't act like it's a big deal," he said. "You've got millions. What's a little help for family?" Family. There was that word again, twisted into something I didn't recognize. I'd spent years trying to fit into their world, taking their jabs, keeping the peace for Sophia's sake, and now they were using it against me. I turned to Sophia, my chest tight, hoping she'd finally say something. "Soph," I said, my voice softer now, almost begging. "You see what they're doing, right?" She looked at me, her eyes flickering with uncertainty, and for a moment, I thought she might nod, might stand by me. But then she stepped forward, her hands dropping to her sides, and her words cut through me like a knife. "You're my husband," she said, her voice firm but shaking a little. "That means my family is your family. You should want to help them." I froze, staring at her, my heart sinking into my stomach. Want to help them? After everything I'd done, paying the bills, keeping us afloat, making sure she never had to worry, she was siding with them? I couldn't believe it. My own wife, the one person I thought I could count on, was looking at me like I was the bad guy. I took a step back, my hands trembling in my pockets. "Help them," I said, my voice low and rough. "I've been helping you all for years, and this is what I get." Sophia's eyes widened, like she didn't know what I meant, but Eleanor cut in before she could ask. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded, her tone dripping with suspicion. I shook my head, not ready to go there yet. I'd save that bomb for later. "It means I don't owe you a damn thing," I said, looking at each of them in turn. Jacob snorted, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, right. Keep telling yourself that," he muttered. Henry just stared at me, his expression hard, like he was waiting for me to crack. And Sophia? She looked away, her lips pressed tight, like she couldn't face me anymore. That's when I knew it, deep down where it hurt the most. She wasn't on my side. Maybe she never had been. Not really. I'd built this life for us, for her, thinking we were a team, But now I saw it clear as day. To her, I was just a means to an end, a way to keep her family happy. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, and I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to give in. But I wouldn't. Not this time. You want my money? I said, my voice steady now, cold as ice. Earn it yourselves. Eleanor gasped. Jacob laughed like I'd told a joke, and Henry shook his head, but I didn't care. I turned to Sophia one last time, hoping for something, anything, to change my mind. She met my gaze, her eyes wet, but she didn't say a word. And that was it. The line was drawn, and I was done playing their game. I couldn't take it anymore. The dining room felt like a cage, with Sophia's family circling me, their demands ringing in my ears. Eleanor's voice was still sharp in my head. Jacob's smirk burned into my vision, and Henry's calm, entitled tone made my blood boil. But the worst part was Sophia, my wife, standing there, telling me I should want to hand over everything I'd built because her family said so. I looked at her, waiting for her to take it back, to realize how insane this all was. But she just stared at me, her face torn between them and me. That's when I snapped. I'd been holding something back, something I'd kept quiet about for years, thinking it was the right thing to do. But now they needed to know the truth, and I was done playing nice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and turned to face them all. You think I haven't helped you? I said, my voice low but hard, cutting through the tension in the room. I've been sending money to your parents for years. $7,000 every single month. The words hung there, heavy and real, and I watched their faces change. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed, her eyes blinking fast like she didn't believe it. Henry shifted in his chair, his calm mask slipping for the first time. Jacob let out a loud, barking laugh, leaning back like I'd just told the punchline of a bad joke. Wait, you're the one who sent that? Eleanor said, her voice quieter now, almost confused. I nodded, keeping my eyes on her. Yeah, me. Every month, straight to your account. No questions asked. Sophia's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide. What? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. You never told me that. I turned to her, feeling a mix of anger and hurt bubbling up. I didn't think I had to, I said. It was for them, to keep things smooth, to make sure they didn't have to ask. I figured it was enough. Jacob laughed again, louder this time, slapping his hand on the table. You actually thought that was helping? He said, grinning like he'd caught me in a lie. That was nothing, man. Pocket change. Nothing. $7,000 a month, 84 grand a year, and he was calling it pocket change? I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms, trying to keep my temper in check. Eleanor recovered fast, her confusion turning back to indignation. If you were sending that much, why didn't you tell us it was you? She demanded, like I tricked them somehow. Because I didn't want this, I shot back, waving a hand at all of them. I didn't want you thinking I was some endless bank account you could tap whenever you felt like it. Henry cleared his throat, sitting up straighter now. Well, that's generous of you, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. But it doesn't change the fact that you've got millions more you could have shared. I stared at him, my chest tight. Generous? I'd been bleeding money for them, and they still wanted more. That's when it hit me, clear as day. No matter what I gave, it'd never be enough. They didn't want help. They wanted control. I turned to Sophia, my voice softer but firm. You knew they were getting money, I said. You never asked where it came from. She shook her head, her hands twisting together. I thought it was from Dad's investments or something, she stammered. You should have told me. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. And what? Have you tell them it was me, so they could start this sooner? She flinched, but she didn't argue. The room went quiet again, and I could feel their eyes on me. Eleanor's glare, Jacob's smirk, Henry's calculating stare. They were waiting for me to back down, to say I'd keep the cash flowing. But I was done. I'd spent years trying to keep the peace, thinking it'd make Sophia happy, but all it had done was dig me deeper into this mess. I pulled out my phone, my hand steady now, and opened my banking app right there in front of them. You want to talk about help? I said, tapping the screen. Let's see how you do without it. I scrolled to the automatic payments, the ones I'd set up years ago, and one by one, I canceled them. $7,000 a month, gone. I hit confirm, the little green checkmark popping up, and looked up at them. Eleanor's face went pale. What are you doing? She asked, her voice rising. Stopping the gravy train. I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. Jacob's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. You can't do that, he said, like he had any say in it. Watch me, I replied, meeting his glare. Henry stood up, his chair scraping loud against the floor. This is ridiculous, he said. You're punishing us for asking for what's fair. I shook my head, almost smiling at how twisted that sounded. No, I said. I'm done letting you think you're entitled to what's mine. Sophia stepped forward, reaching for my arm, but I pulled away. Don't, I warned, my voice sharp. She stopped, her eyes wet, but I didn't care anymore. I'd given them everything I was willing to give, and they'd thrown it back in my face. The truth was out now. They'd never cared about me, just what I could do for them. And as I stood there, watching their shock turn to anger, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't their ATM anymore. I was done. I stood in the dining room, my phone still warm in my pocket from canceling those payments, and watched the chaos unfold. Eleanor's face twisted like I'd just slapped her, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words. Jacob slammed his fist on the table, making the plates rattle, his eyes blazing with fury. Henry just stared at me, his jaw tight, like he couldn't believe I'd actually done it. Sophia reached for me again, her fingers brushing my sleeve, but I stepped back, shaking my head. I'd had enough of their demands, their greed, their entitlement. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel it pressing down on me. But for the first time that night, I wasn't scared or unsure. I was angry, and I was done playing their game. Eleanor's phone dinged, a sharp little chime that cut through the silence. She fumbled for it, her hands shaking, and when she looked at the screen, her eyes went wide. No, she said, her voice rising to a shriek. No, you can't do this. She held up the phone like it was proof, like I'd care about whatever notification just popped up. I knew what it was, the bank alerting her that the automatic deposit was gone. $7,000, wiped out with a tap of my finger. Jacob shot to his feet, his chair tipping back and hitting the floor with a loud thud. You'll regret this, he snarled, his face red and blotchy. We're family, man. You don't screw over family. I looked at him, my voice cold and steady. Not anymore, I said, and I meant it. That word, family, had lost all meaning tonight. Sophia's eyes were wet now, tears spilling down her cheeks, but I couldn't tell if she was crying for me or for them. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't do this. I turned to her, my chest tight, wanting to feel something, pity, maybe, or guilt, but all I felt was betrayal. You did this, I said, keeping my tone flat. You stood there and let them tear into me. You picked them. She shook her head, fast and desperate. No, I didn't. But she couldn't finish, and I didn't wait for her to try. I'd heard enough excuses, enough reasons why I should keep giving, keep bending. I was done bending. I grabbed my laptop from the table, the screen still dark from when Sophia had dropped it there, and tucked it under my arm. I'm leaving, I said, loud enough for all of them to hear. Eleanor gasped, clutching her phone like it could save her. Leaving? She snapped. This is your house. I nodded, grabbing my coat from the rack by the door. Yeah, it is, I said. And I don't want you in it anymore. Jacob took a step toward me, his fists clenched, like he might actually try something. You think you can just walk out? He said, his voice low and threatening. I met his stare, not backing down. Watch me, I said again, and I turned for the door. The cold November air hit me hard as I stepped outside, my breath puffing out in little clouds. I could hear them shouting behind me, Eleanor's shrill voice, Jacob's curses, Sophia calling my name, but I didn't stop. My car was in the driveway, keys still in my coat pocket, and I slid into the driver's seat, tossing the laptop onto the passenger side. The engine roared to life, drowning out their noise, and for a second, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, letting it sink in. I'd walked out of my own house, left my wife and her family standing there, and it felt right. Not good, not yet, but right. Like I'd finally taken something back for myself. I pulled out of the driveway, the headlights cutting through the dark, and headed down the street. I didn't know where I was going, maybe a hotel, maybe my office, but anywhere was better than that house right now. My phone buzzed in my pocket, over and over, and I knew it was them. Sophia, probably, begging me to come back. Eleanor, yelling about how ungrateful I was. Jacob, threatening me like he always did when he didn't get his way. I didn't check it. I turned the radio on instead, some old rock song filling the car, and let it wash over me. The road stretched out ahead, empty and quiet, and for the first time all night, I could think straight. Looking back, that was the moment everything changed. I'd spent years being the good son-in-law, the reliable husband, the guy who kept everyone happy. I'd sent them money, hosted their holidays, taken their crap with a smile, all because I thought it's what you did for family. But they weren't my family, not really. Family doesn't turn on you the second they see a dollar sign. Family doesn't demand your life's work like it's their right. I'd been blind to it, letting Sophia convince me they were worth it, but not anymore. As I drove, the weight started lifting, bit by bit. I wasn't their doormat, their bank, their punching bag. I was me again, and I wasn't going back. The city lights blurred past, and I felt a strange calm settle in. They'd fight me. I knew that. They'd scream and cry and try to guilt me into giving in. But I'd made my choice, and it was final. I'd walked out of that house, out of that life, and I wasn't the good son-in-law anymore. I was done with their rules, their greed, their control. And as the miles ticked by, I realized something else. I didn't regret it. Not one bit. I woke up the next morning in a hotel room, the cheap coffee maker humming on the counter, the city humming outside the window. I'd driven around for hours after leaving the house, my mind racing, until I finally checked into some place downtown just to crash. My phone was still in my coat pocket, buzzing nonstop since I'd walked out, but I hadn't looked at it yet. I didn't want to, not after everything that went down. Sophia's family had crossed a line, and I'd crossed one right back, leaving them standing in my dining room like fools. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. They wouldn't let it go quietly. I sipped the bitter coffee, staring at the blank TV screen, and braced myself for whatever they'd throw at me. It didn't take long. By noon, my phone was blowing up with notifications, not just calls and texts, but social media tags piling up like a storm. I finally caved and checked it, scrolling through Facebook first. There it was, right at the top of Sophia's page, a long, rambling post, typed out in all caps like she was yelling at the world. My husband is a greedy millionaire who abandoned his family. It started, and it only got worse from there. She'd laid it all out. $12 million, the canceled payments, me walking out, painting me as some heartless monster who'd left them high and dry. I scrolled the comments, my stomach twisting as distant relatives chimed in. Unbelievable. How could he do this? Wrote some cousin I'd met maybe twice. What a jerk, added an aunt who'd never said 2 words to me. They didn't know the half of it, but that didn't stop them. Then my work phone rang. My assistant, Marcus, his voice tense. Boss, you need to see this, he said, and I could hear him typing fast. Jacob's been calling people. Your business partners, clients, even some vendors. He's telling them you're a fraud, saying you're hiding money and screwing over your family. I leaned back in the stiff hotel chair, rubbing my face with my hand. Of course Jacob would go there. He couldn't touch my money, so he'd try to ruin my name instead. What's the damage? I asked, keeping my tone steady. Marcus paused, then said, not much yet. Most of them aren't buying it. Sounds like he's just pissed off and ranting. But it's loud. I nodded to myself, staring at the cracked ceiling. Loud was right. They were turning this into a full-on smear campaign, and they'd barely started. I spent the afternoon fielding calls, calming down partners who'd gotten Jacob's nonsense in their inboxes. Most laughed it off. One guy even said, sounds like your brother-in-law's jealous as hell, huh? I didn't bother correcting him about Jacob not being my brother-in-law anymore. But something funny started happening. Instead of hurting me, all this noise was making me look good. A big client, some real estate tycoon I'd been courting for months, called me up out of the blue. Heard you're dealing with some family drama, he said, chuckling. Gotta say, I respect a man who doesn't let himself get pushed around. Let's talk that deal next week. I hung up, stunned. Another client emailed, praising my backbone. By the end of the day, I'd locked in 2 new contracts, big ones. My company's profits were climbing, and it had only been hours. Meanwhile, Sophia's family was falling apart. Marcus dug up some dirt, public records, mostly, and texted me the rundown. Eleanor and Henry's mortgage payment had bounced that morning, the first time in years without my cash propping them up. Jacob's truck was about to get repossessed. He'd missed 3 payments already. Sophia hadn't posted again, but her friends were commenting on her rant, asking why she'd stayed with me if I was so awful. I could picture them scrambling, panicking, trying to figure out how to survive without me footing the bill. It should have felt good, watching them crash, but it didn't. Not completely. There was a hollow spot where Sophia used to be, a piece of me that still remembered the good days before all this. I stayed in that hotel for a week, working remotely, letting the storm play out. The Facebook posts kept coming. Eleanor jumped in, calling me selfish and cruel, while Jacob posted blurry photos of my house, captioning them, "This is what he's hoarding." It was pathetic, but it worked in my favor. My clients loved the drama. They saw me as some kind of rebel, sticking it to the leeches. By the end of the month, my profits had tripled. Tripled. I couldn't believe it. Every time Sophia's family tried to drag me down, they ended up lifting me higher. I leased a new office space, hired 2 more guys to handle the workload, and watched my bank account grow while theirs sank. One night, I sat on the hotel bed, scrolling through the latest round of posts. Sophia had gone quiet, but Eleanor was still at it, begging for sympathy online. "We're losing everything because of him," she wrote, and I felt a pang. Guilt, maybe, or just exhaustion. But then I remembered her voice, demanding a vacation home like it was her right. I remembered Jacob's laugh, calling my help nothing. I remembered Sophia choosing them over me. And that pang faded fast. I shut my phone off, leaned back, and stared out the window at the city lights. I was free, really free, for the first time in years. They could scream all they wanted. I wasn't going back. I thought they'd give up eventually. A month had passed since I walked out, and I'd settled into a new routine. Hotel living, long workdays, and a strange kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Sophia's family had been loud online, trashing me to anyone who'd listen, but I figured they'd run out of steam sooner or later. Their smear campaign hadn't worked the way they wanted. My business was booming, clients were lining up, and I was starting to feel like myself again. I'd even found a new apartment, a sleek place downtown with a view, ready to sign the lease and move on for good. So when Marcus walked into my temporary office one morning, his face a mix of amusement and disbelief, I wasn't ready for what he had to show me. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, sliding his phone across my desk like it was a live grenade. I picked it up, squinting at the screen, and nearly choked on my coffee. It was a website, bright, flashy, with bold red letters screaming, "Jacob's Luxury Investments," at the top. My stomach dropped as I scrolled. There was Jacob's face, grinning in a cheap suit, next to a tagline, "Turning dreams into wealth." He'd slapped together a business, an investment firm, of all things, in my industry. My industry. The guy who couldn't balance his own checkbook was now pretending to be some hotshot money manager. "They really think they can copy me?" I muttered, half to Marcus, half to myself. He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Looks like it. Launched it yesterday. Already got some buzz, mostly bad though." I clicked the reviews section, and sure enough, 1-star ratings were flooding in like a tidal wave. "Scam. They have no idea what they're doing," read the first one, posted by some guy named Tom. "This company misidentified my Rolex as a fake," said another, with a photo of a watch that even I could tell was real from the blurry image. "Do not trust them," warned a third, going on about how Jacob had promised a 20% return in a week and then ghosted when the money vanished. I leaned back in my chair, a laugh bubbling up despite the absurdity of it all. It was pathetic, hilarious, even, but also kind of sad. Jacob wasn't just trying to get back at me. He was trying to be me, and he was failing hard. I handed the phone back to Marcus, shaking my head. "How long you give it?" I asked. He grinned. 3 months, tops. Maybe less if he keeps pissing people off. I spent the rest of the day digging into it, curiosity getting the better of me. Marcus pulled some strings, got me the details. Jacob had sunk everything into this. His truck was gone, repossessed last week, and he'd taken out a loan against his parents' house to fund the startup. Eleanor and Henry were in on it too, listed as consultants on the site, though I doubted they knew a stock from a sock. Sophia's name wasn't there, but I knew she had to be involved somehow, probably cheering them on, thinking this was their big comeback. It was revenge, sure, but it was also desperation. They couldn't touch my money, so they decided to make their own, copying what they thought I did. Except I'd spent years learning this game. Nights studying markets, days building contacts, while Jacob couldn't even spell portfolio right on his homepage. The crash came faster than I expected. 2 months in, Jacob's Luxury Investments was a ghost town. The website was still up, but the phone number was disconnected, and the reviews had turned into a war zone. Angry clients, threats of lawsuits, even a local news story about a shady new firm fleecing investors. Marcus showed me the article one afternoon, chuckling as he read the headline aloud. Family-run investment scam collapses in record time. I skimmed it, seeing Jacob's name in bold, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. He'd lasted less than 3 months, just like Marcus predicted. The loan was called in, the house was on the brink of foreclosure, and Eleanor was back on Facebook, whining about hard times without mentioning why. They'd gambled everything and lost, and I hadn't lifted a finger to make it happen. But Sophia, she wouldn't let go. She'd stopped posting online after that first rant, but she started calling instead. Every few days, my phone would light up with her number, voicemails piling up. "Please, just talk to me," she'd say, her voice soft and shaky. "I know things got bad, but we can fix this. I miss you." I listened to one, then deleted the rest without playing them. Fix this. There was nothing left to fix. She'd picked her side, stood by while her family tried to bleed me dry, and now she thought a few tears would bring me back. I saw her once too, outside my new office, waiting by the door. She looked tired, her hair messy, her eyes red. "I'm sorry," she said when I walked past. I didn't stop, didn't answer. She still thought I'd forgive her, that I'd cave like I always had. But I wasn't that guy anymore. I signed the lease on the apartment that week, moved in with nothing but a suitcase and my laptop. The view was killer, city lights stretching out forever, and I stood by the window one night, sipping a beer, thinking about how far I'd come. Jacob's business was dead, Sophia's family was drowning, and I was free. They tried to copy me, tried to break me, and all they'd done was prove I didn't need them. Sophia's calls kept coming, but I let them ring. She'd figure it out eventually. I wasn't coming back. I was starting to feel like I'd won. It had been a few months since I walked out, and life was good, better than good, actually. My business was thriving, the new apartment was home, and Sophia's family was crumbling under the weight of their own bad choices. Jacob's investment firm was a punchline now, their house was on the foreclosure list, and Eleanor's Facebook rants had turned into pleas for help that nobody answered. I'd blocked their numbers, ignored their emails, and let them fade into the background. I thought that was it, that they'd finally run out of ways to come at me. But I should have known better. They weren't the type to go down quietly. One morning, Marcus walked into my office, his face tight with that look he got when trouble was brewing. "Boss," he said, shutting the door behind him. "Your wife's here, and she brought her family." I sighed, leaning back in my chair, rubbing my temples. Of course she did. I'd moved my office to a new building after the business took off, a sleek, glass-walled space downtown, a step up from the old spot. Security was tight, but I figured Sophia would find a way eventually. "They in the lobby?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, arguing with the guards." Loud. I could picture it. Eleanor waving her arms, Jacob puffing out his chest, Sophia trying to play the peacemaker. I didn't want to deal with them, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, but I knew they wouldn't leave until I showed my face. "All right," I said, standing up. "Let's get this over with." I took the elevator down, my stomach knotting up despite myself. The lobby was a mess when I got there. Eleanor's voice echoing off the marble floors, Jacob pacing like a caged animal, Henry standing off to the side with his arms crossed. Sophia was in the middle, talking fast to a security guard who looked ready to call the cops. They all froze when they saw me step out, the elevator doors hissing shut behind me. Sophia's eyes locked on mine, wide and pleading. "We need to talk," she said, stepping forward, her voice shaky but firm. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "No," I said, calm and cold. "We really don't." She flinched, but she didn't back down. "You're my husband," she snapped, louder now, like it still meant something. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that made her take a step back. "Not anymore," I said, and I meant it. That word, husband, had been dead to me since Thanksgiving, since she stood by while her family tried to gut me. Eleanor pushed past her, jabbing a finger at me. "You think you can just cut us off like this?" she yelled. "We're family. You owe us." Jacob nodded, his face red. "Yeah, man, you can't keep hiding behind your money. Face us like a man." I looked at them, one by one, and felt nothing. No guilt, no anger, just a tired kind of clarity. They were the same people they'd always been, grasping and loud, and I was done letting them drag me down. I pulled out my phone, not breaking eye contact. "You want to talk about hiding?" I said, unlocking the screen. "Let's make this real clear." I opened my banking app, the one I'd used to cancel their payments, and started scrolling. Sophia's name was still on everything: joint accounts, credit cards, even the house deed. I'd been too busy to deal with it before, too focused on building myself back up, but now seemed like the perfect time. "What are you doing?" Sophia asked, her voice rising as she watched me tap away. I didn't answer, just kept going, removing her from the checking account first. One click, and she was gone. Then the savings, another click. Credit cards, cut off. Insurance, done. I got to the house, the big one they'd eaten my Thanksgiving dinner in, and transferred the deed to my name only. It took maybe 2 minutes, right there in front of them, with the lobby security guards watching like it was a show. Sophia's face went white. "Stop it," she whispered, but I didn't. I hit confirm on the last change, the little green checkmark popping up, and slid my phone back into my pocket. "You're nothing to me now," I said, looking straight at her. "Officially." Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest like she'd been shot. "You monster," she screeched. Jacob took a step forward, fists clenched, but the guards moved in, hands on their radios. "Escort them out," I told the head guard, a big guy named Tony who'd been with me since the new office opened. He nodded, motioning to his team. "Let's go, folks," he said, his voice firm but bored, like he dealt with this every day. They didn't go easy. Eleanor shrieked about lawsuits. Jacob yelled threats I knew he couldn't back up, and Henry just glared, silent and useless as always. Sophia grabbed my arm as the guards pulled her back, her nails digging in. "Please," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this to me." I shook her off, stepping back. "You did this to yourself," I said, and turned away. The guards hauled them out, their voices fading as the glass doors swung shut behind them. I stood there for a minute, watching them stumble onto the sidewalk, Sophia collapsing against her mom, Jacob kicking a trash can like a kid throwing a tantrum. Then I went back to the elevator, hit the button for my floor, and let it close. Upstairs, Marcus was waiting, eyebrows raised. "That it?" he asked. I nodded, sinking into my chair. "Yeah," I said. "That's it." They were gone. Out of my life, out of my accounts, out of my world. I felt lighter, like I'd finally cut the last rope tying me to them. The office hummed around me, phones ringing, deals closing, and I smiled. A real one, for the first time in months. They'd come for a fight, and I'd ended it. Now I could move on. I sat in my penthouse a year later, the Chicago skyline stretching out in front of me like a painting, all sharp lines and glowing lights. The whiskey in my glass was smooth, expensive, the kind I'd never have bought back when I was still trying to keep Sophia's family happy. The place was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but it was mine, every inch of it. No catering trays cluttering the counters, no voices demanding more, just me and the hum of the city below. I'd moved in after that final showdown in the lobby, trading the hotel for this high-rise life, and it felt like a reward. My business had taken off in ways I hadn't dreamed. New clients, bigger deals, profits that made that 12 million look like a starting point. I swirled the whiskey, watching the ice clink against the glass, and let myself think back on it all. It had been a hell of a ride, but I'd come out on top. The numbers told the story best. My wealth had tripled since I cut them loose. 36 million and climbing. Every dollar earned through my own sweat and smarts. The company had grown too. New offices, more staff, a reputation that carried weight. Clients loved the story of the guy who stood up to his greedy in-laws. It had become a kind of legend in the business world. I'd laugh when they brought it up, brushing it off with a shrug, but deep down, I was proud. I'd built this, not them, and I'd kept it mine. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking under me, and took a sip, letting the warmth spread through my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next demand. Sophia's family, though, they were a different story. I didn't check on them much, didn't need to, but bits and pieces trickled in anyway. Marcus kept me updated, half out of loyalty, half because he thought it was funny. The house was gone, foreclosed on months ago after Jacob's business tanked and took their last savings with it. Eleanor and Henry were renting some cramped apartment now, scraping by on whatever they could cobble together. Jacob was worse off, his truck long gone, his name blacklisted after all those scam reviews. Last I heard, he was working odd jobs, bouncing from one gig to the next, still blaming me for everything. I'd see their Facebook posts sometimes, slipping through the cracks of my blocks. Eleanor whining about betrayal, Jacob ranting about how I'd ruined them. It didn't faze me anymore. They dug their own hole. Sophia was the wild card. She'd tried hard to pull me back after that lobby scene. Calls, texts, even showing up at the old office once before I moved. I never answered, never opened the door. Eventually, she slowed down, the voicemails getting shorter, sadder. "I just want to talk," she'd say, or "I miss us." I'd delete them, not because I hated her, though part of me did, but because there was nothing left to say. She'd made her choice, standing with them instead of me, and I'd made mine. Last I heard, she was living with her parents, working some retail job to help pay their rent. Her friends had posted about it online, pitying her, but I didn't feel sorry. She'd had a life with me, a good one, and she'd thrown it away for them. My phone buzzed on the table, snapping me out of my thoughts. I picked it up, expecting Marcus or a client, but it was a missed call from Sophia. Another one. The voicemail popped up a second later, and against my better judgment, I played it. Her voice was soft, tired. "Hey," she said, pausing like she wasn't sure how to start. "I saw your name in some article today. Sounds like you're doing great. I'm happy for you, I guess. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Again, I know you won't call back, but I had to try." The line went quiet, then clicked off. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Happy for me. Sorry. It didn't change anything. I hit delete, tossed the phone back on the table, and took another sip of whiskey. She could keep trying, but I was done listening. I stood up, walking to the window, the glass cool against my hand as I pressed it there. The city sparkled below, alive and moving, and I felt a grin tug at my lips. I'd lost a lot that year, my marriage, my old house, any illusion of family, but I'd gained more. Freedom for one. Control. A life that was mine, not theirs. I thought about Thanksgiving. That night everything broke, and how far I'd come since. They tried to take me down, tried to guilt me, smear me, copy me, and every time, they'd failed. I'd walked away, cut them off, and built something better. The best decision I'd ever made wasn't some big investment or deal. It was leaving that dining room, keys in hand, and not looking back. My phone buzzed again. Another email, probably, or some desperate plea from one of them. I didn't check. I turned it off instead, setting the glass down and stretching out on the couch. The skyline glowed, the whiskey settled in my veins, and I laughed. A real, deep laugh that echoed in the empty room. They were still drowning, still clawing, and I was up here, untouchable. I closed my eyes, the city humming outside, and let it sink in. I was free, truly, completely free, and I'd never felt better. Whatever they did next, it didn't matter. I was done with them, and I wasn't going back.